The folder was the first thing Lorraine Briggs packed and the last thing she put in the car. Not because it was fragile. It was not fragile. It was a manila folder, the standard kind, the kind you could find in any office supply store for $1.50, and it had survived 30 years of being opened and closed and moved from drawer to drawer and apartment to apartment without sustaining any damage that mattered. It was not fragile, but it was specific in a way that fragile things sometimes are not specific in the way of objects that have absorbed the weight of everything that has been placed in them over a long time, and Lorraine treated it accordingly. She put it on the front seat, not in a box, not in a bag. On the seat within reach, the way you keep something you might want to look at on a long drive. Walter noticed. He did not say anything. He had been married to this woman for 53 years, and in 53 years, he had learned the difference between the things Lorraine did that invited comment and the things she did that simply needed to be witnessed. This was a thing to witness. He loaded the last box into the trunk, closed it, and walked around to the driver's side without a word. They drove out of Hartwell, Ohio on a Saturday morning in May, the moving truck following behind them, and Lorraine kept her hand near the folder the entire time. This is where it is necessary to understand something about Lorraine Briggs that is not obvious from the outside and is perhaps not obvious even to people who have known her for a long time. Lorraine was the kind of woman who did not speak her plans until she was certain they were real. She had learned this early in the way that people who grow up with limited resources learn early the particular discipline of not wanting things out loud, because wanting things out loud invites a specific kind of disappointment that is different from the disappointment of wanting things quietly. She had learned to carry her hopes inside the folder where they were safe, where they were hers, where no one could look at them and tell her whether they were reasonable. This practice had served her well for 30 years. The folder had started in 1993, which was not the first year Lorraine had thought about owning a house, but was the first year she had started treating the thought as a project rather than a wish. She had been 43 years old working in the administrative offices of the Kellerman manufacturing plant outside Hartwell, where she had managed inventory records and production schedules and the kind of documentation that a large industrial operation requires someone to maintain with precision and without complaint. She was good at documentation. She understood that the difference between a record and a piece of paper was the care that went into keeping it. The first item in the folder was a photograph torn from a magazine in the waiting room of her dentist's office in November of 1993. She had been sitting there with a month-old issue of a home design publication, waiting for the hygienist to call her name, and she had turned a page and seen a stone cottage in Vermont photographed in October light, surrounded by maples that had gone the specific shade of red that October maples go when the conditions are exactly right. She had looked at it for a long time. Then, when she was certain no one was watching, she had torn the page out carefully along the seam and folded it once and put it in her purse. At home that evening, she had opened the kitchen drawer where she kept important papers, found a manila folder, and placed the photograph inside it. She had not mentioned it to Walter. It did not seem like the kind of thing that required mentioning yet. Walter that year was 46 and had been working at the plant for 22 years. He was a good man with good hands and a practical mind, the kind of mind that solved problems by taking them apart and looking at each component until the solution became clear. He had grown up in a family that rented, and he had grown up understanding that this was a condition, not a destiny, and that conditions could be changed with sufficient time and sufficient work. He had been working toward the change for 22 years. He had not stopped working toward it. But the number was not there yet, and Walter was not a man who spoke about things before the number was there. So they did not discuss the house that year or the years immediately after. But they did discuss other things that were part of the same conversation in the way that long married people discuss parts of a thing without discussing the whole. They discussed the savings rate. They discussed the pension timeline. They discussed what retirement might look like, what kind of place they might want to be in, what kind of neighborhood, what kind of street. They drove slowly through certain neighborhoods on Sunday mornings, and Lorraine would note the specific qualities of the houses they passed with the attention of someone who was building a record. The folder grew. Not quickly. Lorraine was not impulsive in her curation. She added things when she found something that was genuinely right, not merely attractive. A farmhouse in Tennessee in 2008 found on a real estate website that she had printed and folded and placed behind the Vermont cottage with a note on the back, timing wrong, financial crisis keep. The year of that note was a year when the timing was wrong for almost everything, and Lorraine had closed the websites and put the folder in the drawer and not opened it again for 6 months. But she had not thrown it away. That was the point of the folder. It did not need to be looked at to do its work. It only needed to be kept. On a Sunday afternoon in 2015, they had been driving back from visiting their daughter Caroline in Cincinnati, taking the longer route through Western Virginia because the traffic on the highway was bad, and Walter preferred moving slowly on back roads to sitting still on freeways. They had passed through a small town called Grayfield, moving at the pace of people who are not in a hurry, and Lorraine had looked out the window at a house set back from the road, a wood and stone structure with an established garden, and the particular quality of a place that has been lived in for a long time by people who cared about it. She had taken out her phone and photographed it through the car window without saying anything to Walter. At home, she had printed the photograph and written on the back, "This town. Someday." She had placed it in the folder behind the Tennessee farmhouse printout. She did not tell Walter about the photograph for 7 years. This is not a story about secrets. Lorraine was not keeping a secret from her husband. She was keeping a plan, which is a different thing. A plan held privately is an act of protection, not concealment. If she had told Walter about Grayfield, about the feeling she had when they drove through it, he would have looked at the numbers, which was the right thing to do, and the numbers in 2015 were not ready, which was also true, and the conversation would have ended there, in the reasonable place where conversations about things that are not yet possible end. She did not want the conversation to end there. She wanted it to wait the way the folder waited, keeping the possibility alive until the moment it could become something real. She was in this way the most patient person Walter had ever known. He understood this about her in a general sense. He would come to understand it more specifically later. They retired in stages. Lorraine first at 68, when the third-floor walk-up they had lived in since the kids were grown became a negotiation she was no longer willing to have with her knees twice a day. She had worked at the plant for 27 years in the administrative offices, maintaining the records with the same precision she brought to everything. And when she left, the woman who replaced her required 3 weeks of training to understand the filing system Lorraine had built and maintained without explanation or complaint for nearly 3 decades. Walter stayed 3 years longer than he had planned because the pension was structured to reward it, and the pension was what the house was going to depend on, and Walter understood numbers. He retired at 72. 3 years after that, on an evening in March, they sat at the kitchen table in the third-floor apartment with the documents spread between them, and Lorraine went through the numbers the way she had always gone through numbers, methodically, without drama. And when she reached the bottom of the last column, she looked up. "It's there," she said. Walter looked at the number. He had been looking at various iterations of this number for 30 years, and he recognized immediately that this was the real version of it, not the projected version or the optimistic version, but the number that was actually there when you added everything up correctly and did not pretend about any of the components. He felt something he did not immediately have a word for. It was not simply happiness. It was larger than happiness and older than happiness and more specific. It was the feeling of arriving at a place that had been real in the future for so long that you had sometimes in the difficult years wondered if the future was real, and now it was the present, and the present had the number in it, and the number was sufficient. "We're going to do it," he said. He said it quietly. Lorraine reached across the table and put her hand on his. She did not cry. That was not Lorraine's way with things that mattered most. The things that mattered most she met with a specific stillness, a settling into herself, the particular composure of a woman who has been holding something for a long time and feels finally the weight of it shift. They began looking at listings that week. Lorraine ran the search. This was appropriate and natural. She had been running the search in her head and in her folder for 30 years, and she understood the parameters with a precision that Walter could not have matched because he had not been keeping the records. She knew what they were looking for, not just in the practical sense of square footage and price range and proximity to services, but in the more specific sense of character of the particular quality a house has when it has been lived in well and intends to go on being lived in. She ran the search every morning for 3 weeks. On a Tuesday morning in early spring at 9:15, she found the Ivy Cottage. It appeared in the results from a real estate company out of Grayfield, Virginia. The price was within their range. The description mentioned original character, established gardens, the quiet charm of a property that had been part of its community for generations. She looked at the listing for 4 minutes without touching anything. Then she picked up her phone and sent Walter a message. This one. He called her back in 4 minutes. The photographs were beautiful. There were 11 of them taken in what appeared to be late afternoon light, the golden hour that photographers choose, because it makes everything look the way things look in memory. The house was barely visible and most of them covered in a dense cascade of green and flowering vines, so thorough that the structure was more suggestion than fact, a shape inside a garden. Where the facade was partially visible, it had the warm, weathered quality of old wood that has been in the same place for a very long time. Lorraine looked at each photograph twice. Then she looked at them again. And then she noticed something that she noted without immediately deciding what it meant. 11 photographs. Facade, garden, vines, the stone path disappearing into depth, the quality of the afternoon light on the flowering growth. 11 photographs and not one of them showed the interior of the house. She set the thought aside not because it did not matter, but because she was not yet sure what it meant, and Lorraine did not form conclusions before she had sufficient information. She called the number on the listing. The realtor's name was Denton Hale. He had the voice of a man who had spent years making people feel that the thing they were considering was also the thing they deserved, and that the two of those facts combined to create an urgency that was not manufactured, but simply real. He was knowledgeable. He was unhurried in the way that skilled salespeople are unhurried, which is to say that he created the feeling of having all the time in the world, while simultaneously conveying that time was precisely what was running out. He described the property with the fluency of someone who knew it well. The original construction, the established vine growth that gave the cottage its name, the community feel of Grayfield, which was exactly the kind of small Virginia town that people who knew what they were looking for looked for. The value of a property at this price point in a market that was moving. And then with the casual authority of someone presenting an obvious fact rather than a calculated pressure, there was significant interest. Several parties had expressed serious intent. Properties with this kind of character in this kind of market did not stay available. Lorraine understood this kind of pressure in the abstract, which is to say she recognized it as a technique. She had worked in administration long enough to recognize when information was being presented in a way designed to move a person toward a decision rather than to inform them. She recognized it, and she felt it anyway because recognition and immunity are different things, and the folder had been waiting for 30 years, and Grayfield was in the folder. She asked about seeing the property. Denton explained that the sellers were abroad, and the property was between management arrangements, a scheduling issue that made viewing in the near term complicated. He could certainly arrange something in the coming weeks if they wanted to wait. The coming weeks, he added, with the lightness of a man who was not applying pressure, just noting a reality might be too late given the level of interest. Lorraine thanked him and ended the call. She called Walter. There are no interior photographs, she said. He was quiet. I know, she said, but I also know this town, and I know this listing. And I think this might be the one. They talked for 2 evenings. They called Caroline, who was cautious in the way of a daughter who loves her parents and is trying to protect them without overriding their autonomy. She asked careful questions. She looked at the listing herself. She noted, as Lorraine had noted, the absence of interior photographs and said so directly. And Denton's explanation for the absence was when Caroline heard it secondhand less satisfying than it had been when Lorraine heard it firsthand. But the folder was in the desk drawer, and Grayfield was in the folder, and the number was finally there. On the third evening, Lorraine made the decision. She told Walter, and they called Denton together, and Walter made the offer, and the paperwork was signed electronically, which Caroline helped them manage over a video call. The money transferred on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Lorraine Briggs was the owner of the Ivy Cottage on Grayfield Road in Grayfield, Virginia. She did not cry when the confirmation email arrived. She sat very still and looked at the screen for a long time. Walter was watching her from across the kitchen, and he saw in her face the expression he had seen only a few times in 53 years, the expression she got when something mattered more than composure could fully contain the expression that meant she was in the presence of something she had been carrying for so long that setting it down felt itself like a physical experience. 30 years, she said. He came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, and she put her hands over his, and they stood in the kitchen of the third-floor walk-up that had never been theirs and would never be theirs and was already becoming the last place they had been before everything changed. She packed the folder last. The drive to Grayfield took 4.5 hours. Lorraine sat in the passenger seat with the folder in her lap, not looking at it, just keeping it within reach. She had added the Ivy Cottage listing photographs to it the week before, printed and trimmed, her most recent entry in 30 years of keeping the record. The folder was a history. It was also, she sometimes thought, the most faithful thing she owned. It had never told her the timing was wrong when she needed to believe the timing would eventually be right. It had simply held everything she put into it, without comment or diminishment, the way certain people hold things, the way certain places hold things, the way the right house holds the life that happens inside it. Walter drove. She knew when they were getting close because he slowed down without being asked, the way he had always slowed down in neighborhoods they were passing through that deserved more than passing speed. "It should be this next one," she said. He slowed further. The house was there. It was recognizable as the house in the photographs, the way a person is recognizable in a photograph taken 20 years ago. The structure was present, but the details were different from what the images had suggested, or rather more extreme than the images had suggested. The vines were considerably more than the listing photographs had shown. They covered not just the facade, but the entire front of the structure, climbing to the roofline, and beyond it reaching along the sides in tendrils that had worked their way under the eaves and around the corners. The stone path from the photographs was invisible beneath a season of unmanaged growth. The garden was a tangle. The front gate was rusted in the particular way of gates that have not been regularly opened. The photographs were old, Walter said. He said it carefully, the way he said things when he was managing a fact rather than stating it. Lorraine did not respond immediately. She was looking at the house with the specific attention of a woman who has been looking at houses for 30 years and understands what she's looking at. She was noting what she saw, and she was noting what it meant, and she was holding alongside both of those observations the folder in her lap. She opened the car door. The gate protested when she pushed it. She found the stone path under the overgrowth and walked it carefully, noting where the stones had shifted. The smell reached her before she was halfway to the door, damp and enclosed, and beneath that something older. The smell of a space that has been sealed against air for too long. She found the key from the courier packet and let herself in. The interior was dim. The vine coverage outside was so thorough that the windows admitted very little light. When her eyes adjusted, what she saw confirmed what the smell had been preparing her for. The ceiling in the front room carried a water stain that covered most of its surface. The concentrated dark rings of repeated leaks over many years never addressed. The walls showed the gray-black pattern of mold that had been left to expand unchecked. The floor was original wood, and she could see that, but it was original wood that had been exposed to moisture over time, and when she tested it with her foot, it gave. She went back outside to Walter, who was standing on the path. "How much?" he said. She looked at the house. She looked at the vines, which covered it so thoroughly that the condition of what lay beneath them was impossible to assess from outside. "I don't know yet," she said. "Come in with me." The first week was the kind of week that tests what a person is made of. Not by presenting them with impossible problems, but by presenting them with problems that are possible, achievable, addressable, and simply require more than you currently have. Lorraine was not a woman who catastrophized. She had spent 27 years managing records in an industrial operation where problems were facts to be addressed rather than occasions for distress. She brought the same approach to the house. She had a legal pad. By the end of the first 4 days, she had filled 3 pages. The roof, the electrical system, which a licensed electrician described on the 3rd day in the measured language of a professional who was not trying to alarm, but could not in good conscience minimize. It needed to be completely replaced. The plumbing had multiple failure points. The basement, which she had not known existed until she found the door behind the kitchen, had standing water. 3 pages of facts. On the evening of the 4th day, she sat at the card table they had set up in the front room. The good furniture was still in the moving truck, which they were keeping on the street until they understood the floors better. She looked at the 3 pages. She thought about the folder, which was in the desk she had set up in the room she had designated as her reading room, the room with the window she had specifically requested because it faced east and would catch the morning light. She allowed herself for a moment to feel the full distance between what she had imagined and what she was looking at. Then she closed the legal pad. She made tea on the camp stove she had brought for exactly this kind of contingency because Lorraine Thompson had been managing contingencies her whole life, and she prepared for them the way she prepared for everything ahead of time, quietly without announcement. She brought Walter his cup and sat beside him. "We've been through harder," she said. He looked at her. "Name one." She thought about it. 1987, she said. "When the plant cut shifts and we had 4 months on your reduced salary with 2 kids in school and Emma's braces." He was quiet for a moment. "Fair," he said. "And 2003, she said, when my mother was sick and we drove to Columbus every other weekend for 6 months and you had the shoulder surgery the same year." "Also fair," he said. "This is a house," she said. "It's a bad house, but it's our house. No one can tell us to leave." He put his hand over hers on the table. He did not say anything because there was not anything to add. The next morning, Lorraine knocked on the door of the house 2 doors down, the one with the carefully maintained garden, and the lights on early, the signals of someone who was home and keeping reasonable hours. The man who answered was 71 years old with white hair and the manner of someone who said what he meant and meant what he said. His name was Everett Prushaw. He had lived on Grayfield Road for 30 years. He had brought pie on that first day, the second day of their arrival, a blueberry pie made with the particular care of someone who understands that pie is a form of communication. She had thought about him since. The open face of someone who has information and is deciding whether to share it. Now she stood at his door, without pie, without preamble. She said, "I think you know something about our house. I think you knew something when you brought the pie. I would like you to tell me what it is." Everett looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man whose assessment has been confirmed. "Come in," he said. They sat at his kitchen table, which was the kind of table that had been in the same kitchen for decades and had developed the particular authority of furniture that has witnessed things. He made coffee without asking. She accepted it without comment. He told her what he knew. The house had been built in the 1880s by an architect named Edmund Vail, who had designed several prominent structures in the Grayfield area during the period, and who had died in 1931 without direct heirs. The property had passed through owners in the decades following, the last of whom had departed 4 years ago, under circumstances that Everett described as abrupt and unclear. The house had been vacant since. The county had condemned it, he said. Lorraine set her coffee cup down. About a year after it went vacant, routine inspection found structural issues. Years of deferred maintenance and the vine growth. The county posted the notice. Lorraine said Denton Hale. Everett's expression changed in a specific way. Not surprise. The confirmation of a suspicion that had been waiting to be named. He said the name back to her the way you say a name you have been expecting. "He's been involved with distressed properties in this area before," Everett said. "He finds people who don't know what questions to ask." Lorraine said, "I knew there were no interior photographs. I asked him about it. He told me the interior was being refreshed and photos were coming." "The precision of it," she said. "Not a lie you could point to, just a sentence designed to move you past the question." "Most people move past it," Everett said. "That's what he counts on." She was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone who is absorbing information rather than reacting to it. "What about the legal position?" she said. "Can he sell a condemned property?" "Legally, not much standing," Everett said. "But the question is what he disclosed before you signed." He paused. "Did the contract mention the condemnation?" She thought about the contract, the dense technical language, Caroline on the video call helping them read through it section by section, Denton's reassuring explanations, each clause made smooth and reasonable as he walked them through it. "We need to find the contract," she said. "Yes," Everett said. "And you need an attorney who handles real estate fraud." He said the word without drama, the way you say the accurate word for a thing. Then he said, "There's something else." She looked at him. "About the house. About what Vail left behind." Everett had been a reader his whole life, and 30 years of living in Grayfield had made him a specific kind of reader. The kind who pursues the history of the place where he lives with the thoroughness of someone who believes that understanding where you are is part of the work of being there. He had read about Vail. He knew about the buildings Vail had designed in the region, the courthouse, 2 private residences, a small church. He knew about Vale's practice documented in the local historical society's archives of placing his important documents inside the structures themselves rather than entrusting them to banks. Vale had read about fires, Everett said, about families losing everything when houses burned. He had decided that good construction was more trustworthy than external institutions. He built what the records called a secured cavity into several of his structures, Everett said, not a room. A space inside the wall reinforced sealed built for the specific purpose of holding documents through whatever happened to the structure around it. I don't know if this house has one, he said, but I know Vale built this house, and I know the section of wall that cracked when the vine came down is on the interior facing side, which is where, based on what I've read about the other Vale buildings, the secured space would be. Lorraine looked at him for a moment. Before I call the attorney, she said. Yes, he said. She stood up from the table. She called Walter from Everett's front step. When he answered, she said, get the flashlights from the car. Both of them, and bring the toolkit from the trunk. He did not ask why. He knew her well enough to know that when she said, get the toolkit, there was a reason, and the reason would be explained when she arrived. They met at the front gate. Everett came from his house carrying a third flashlight, which he had anticipated needing. The three of them went in together. The section of wall that had cracked when the gardening crew pulled the large section of vine was in the front room to the right of the main entrance. The crack had run from the upper molding to the floor and opened wide enough to show the interior of the wall cavity, the space between the interior plaster and the exterior wood, which in a structure built in the 1880s was considerable. Lorraine held her flashlight to the gap and looked. There, she said. She stepped back and let Walter look. It was not dramatic in its appearance. A metal box approximately the size of a large hardcover book set into a bracket that had been constructed as part of the wall framing. It had a handle and a keyhole. No key. The metal was dark with the oxidation of decades, but it appeared intact, and the sealed environment of the wall had protected it from the moisture damage visible everywhere else in the structure. Lorraine looked at the bracket. She looked at how it was attached. Then she looked at Walter. She did not have to say anything. He was already reaching for the toolkit. He worked at it for 40 minutes. The hardware had been set in place over 100 years ago and had no intention of cooperating quickly. Walter worked at it with the patience of a man who had spent 50 years in manufacturing and understood that the alternative to patience was damage, and he had already had enough damage for 1 week. Lorraine stood beside him and held the light steady. Everett stood at a respectful distance because this was their discovery, not his. The box came free at 12:40. They carried it to the card table in the front room and set it in the beam of the lantern they had brought in. Lorraine sat across from it. Walter stood beside her. Everett stayed near the doorway. The lock was a standard type. Lorraine recognized it from the filing cabinets in the administrative office at the plant. Walter worked at it for 20 minutes. It opened with a sound that was less of a click than a sigh, the sound of something releasing after a very long time. Inside, wrapped in oilskin cloth, were documents. Lorraine unfolded the oilskin with care. Walter stood beside her. The documents were handwritten in the deliberate penmanship of someone who wrote with the awareness that their words would need to be read by people they could not know. Several pages had yellowed with age but remained legible. Others, on heavier stock, had held their color better. They were property deeds, multiple deeds, all in the name of Edmund Vale, covering parcels of land in Grayfield County and the surrounding region. Everett came forward. He read over their shoulders with the focused attention of a man who knows the land being described and is understanding as he reads what he is looking at. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. There was also a letter. It was addressed to no one. The date indicated 1928, 3 years before Vale died. Lorraine picked it up. She did not read it immediately. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the paper, which was heavier than ordinary paper, the kind of paper chosen by someone who intended their words to last. Then she handed it to Walter. He read it aloud slowly in the dim room with the lantern casting its circle of light, and his voice was steady in the way his voice was steady when things mattered. Vale had written that he had no children, that his family had preceded him in death, and that he had spent his life building things and acquiring land in the belief that land was the only thing that did not diminish when you were not attending to it. He had placed these documents inside the house because he trusted the house more than he trusted the institutions of his time, which had proved in his experience to be less durable than honest construction. He had written to whoever finds this. These lands are for the one who was meant to find them, whoever had the patience to wait for the walls to speak. Walter stopped reading. The room was very quiet. Lorraine looked down at the folder she had carried into the house without thinking, the same folder she had carried for 30 years. The same folder she had kept on her lap on the drive to Grayfield. The same folder that had a photograph in it from 2015 with "This town, someday" written on the back. She put her hand on it. Everett was still reading the deeds. His voice when he spoke had the quality of someone who is understanding something as they say it. "These parcels," he said, "I know some of these. I've watched these properties for years. Several of them are still vacant." He stopped. He looked at Lorraine, then at Walter, then back at the documents. "You're going to need an attorney," he said, "not just for Hale, for this." Outside, through the vine-covered windows of the condemned house on Grayfield Road, the May morning was continuing without them as mornings do. Somewhere in the direction of the street, the moving truck was still waiting with their good furniture, the furniture they had not yet brought inside because they were not yet sure about the floors. Inside, Lorraine Briggs sat at a card table in a house that had every visible reason to be the worst thing that had ever happened to her, with her hand on a manila folder that had held 30 years of waiting. And she thought about what Edmund Vale had written in 1928 about patience and walls and the particular kind of person that certain things were meant for. She thought about the dentist's waiting room in 1993, the stone cottage in Vermont, the October maples, the page torn carefully along the seam. She thought about 2015, the Sunday drive through Grayfield, the photograph taken through a car window, the words written on the back of the print in her handwriting. "This town. Someday." She did not know yet what the deeds were worth. She did not know yet what the legal path looked like. She did not know yet what it would take to build something real from what was currently rubble. But she had been keeping this folder for 30 years without knowing where it would lead, and she had not given up, and the walls had spoken, and the folder was still here, and she was still here, and Walter's hand was on her shoulder, and Everett Prushaw was standing in the doorway of the condemned house with a flashlight and 30 years of neighborhood knowledge and the particular quality of a person who is in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. She opened the folder. She placed the letter from Edmund Vale at the very back behind the Vermont cottage in the Tennessee farmhouse and the photograph of Grayfield through a car window. Then she closed it, not because she was done, because this was how she worked. You keep the record. You add to it when you have something worth adding. You close it carefully, and then you do what needs doing. She looked at Walter. She looked at Everett. "Call the attorney," she said, "and tell me everything you know about Edmund Vale." Silas Brannett was 56 years old and had been building in the Grayfield region for 30 years, and he had the particular quality of a man who has done one thing well for a long time and no longer needs to explain himself. He walked the perimeter of the property twice before he said anything. He knocked on the remaining wall sections. He crouched at the corner where the foundation met the soil and ran his hand along the joint with the focused attention of someone reading something written in a language most people no longer spoke. Then he stood up and looked at Lorraine. "Most of it has to come down," he said. "The upper structure, everything above the foundation line. There's no salvaging it." Lorraine nodded. She had arrived at this conclusion herself 3 days earlier, through the matrix, through the structural engineer's report, through the simple observation that a building whose facade had been held upright by vegetation for several years had already communicated its essential message about what remained viable. She had prepared herself for hearing it said out loud. But preparation and reception were still different things, and hearing Silas say it plainly standing in the garden in the September light, with the house visible behind him, produced in her a specific kind of finality. The photographs in the folder, the 11 listing photographs, showed the house as it had appeared when Denton Hale had photographed it years ago. Whatever that version of the house had been, it was ending now. Whatever came next would be different. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "The foundation." Silas said, "The foundation is the best I've seen in 40 years of this work." Whoever laid it understood what they were doing. The mortar is original and intact. The stone is set in a way I cannot fully explain because they were doing things in the 1880s that we've since decided were inefficient and then discovered were actually optimal. It doesn't need to be replaced. It needs to be built on. Walter was standing beside her. She heard the particular quality of his silence, which was the silence of a man who has spent 50 years in manufacturing and knows the difference between a salvageable frame and a lost one, and who has just received confirmation of what he suspected. Keep the foundation, Lorraine said. Yes, Silas said, keep the stone path. He looked at it, the path they had worked stone by stone over the previous weeks, re-leveling each piece, resetting the ones that had shifted. We can work around it, he said. We can make it part of the design. The door frame, she said. The oak one. The original. Silas had found it during his assessment intact beneath the overgrowth on the right side of the entrance. Solid white oak, the kind of wood that was milled in an era when wood was understood to be structural rather than cosmetic. I can incorporate it, he said. Front entrance. It'll look like it was always meant to be there because it was. She looked at the left side of the property, at the stone arch with the vines that Everett had identified as part of Vale's original garden design, at the particular way they grew along the arch rather than over it, cooperative rather than consuming. The vines on the arch, she said, the ones that aren't structural, the ones that aren't in the walls. Silas looked at them. Those can stay, he said. They're growing correctly. Someone trained them at some point, or they found their own way to the structure. Either way, they're not doing damage. They're doing what they're supposed to do. Lorraine thought about Vale, about a man who designed gardens as deliberately as he designed structures, who understood that the living things around a building were part of what the building was. The vines had simultaneously destroyed the house and preserved the box. They had penetrated the walls and made them fail, which had opened the crack, which had exposed the condemnation notice, which had led to Everett, which had led to everything that followed. The disaster and the key to ending it had been the same thing. She was not sentimental about vegetation in the abstract, but she understood what these particular vines represented, and she intended to keep the ones that could be kept. She said, "Good. We work around the arch." Silas made notes. They walked the property for another hour, Lorraine directing and Silas assessing, and Walter contributing the specific technical observations of a man who had spent 50 years understanding physical systems. It was, Lorraine thought, the kind of collaboration that works because each person brings what they actually know rather than performing a broader competence they don't have. When they were done, she had 3 more pages in the legal pad. The scope of work, the sequencing, the budget, which Silas presented without softening because Lorraine had made clear at the outset of the meeting that she wanted numbers she could plan with, not numbers designed to seem more manageable than they were. The number was significant. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the folder on the card table beside her. They had 5 parcels. Constance was moving on the hail fraud case simultaneously. The fund returned from the fraud settlement, plus the value of the land assets once the legal claims were established, plus what remained of their savings after the renovation costs, produced a situation that was not comfortable in the way that comfort is easy, but was viable in the way that matters more. They had done harder math in harder years. She said, "When can you start?" "October 1st, Isa said. "If we begin in October, we're framed before the worst of the winter. Mechanical systems over the winter. Finish work in the spring." She said October 1st. He put his hand out. She shook it. The construction began on a clear morning in October when the mountains to the west were visible in the particular way they are visible in early autumn, when the air has lost the haze of summer and the distances resolve into a sharpness that makes you stop and look before you go inside. Walter stopped. Lorraine stood beside him. She did not tell him to stop looking. She had spent 50 years married to a man who knew when to stop and look at things, and she considered it one of his better qualities. The work that followed had the texture of honest work honestly done. It was not smooth. There were problems that were smaller than they could have been, and solutions that cost more than initially estimated, and sequences that needed to be revised when the reality of the existing structure revealed itself differently than the plan had anticipated. Silas managed all of it without drama, which was what Lorraine had hired him to do and what he did. She was present every day, not to manage him. That was his job. She was present because the house was being made and she had been waiting for the house to be made for 30 years, and she was not going to be somewhere else while it happened. She made decisions, everyday decisions. The kitchen window was positioned to catch the morning light, which was where kitchen windows belonged, according to 30 years of accumulated understanding of what made a kitchen work. The fireplace in the front room was a real one, with a hearth she had chosen from the samples Silas brought to the rental apartment, a flat fieldstone in the warm gray of the local geology. The guest room was designed with the grandchildren in mind, as it had always been in the imagining, with the specific things that grandchildren required: bunk beds, a window seat that was also storage, a closet big enough to hold the things that accumulated without being organized. Each decision came from the folder. She did not always open it. She did not need to open it because, after 30 years, the folder was inside her as much as it was in the desk drawer, part of the way she understood what a house should be. But on the evenings when she sat with Silas going over the next week's plans, she often had it on the table beside her, and sometimes she would open it to a specific page. The kitchen window from the Vermont cottage. The arrangement of the front room from the Tennessee farmhouse printout. The proportion of the garden to the house from the photograph she had taken through the car window in 2015. Silas noticed the folder after the second week. He did not ask about it directly. He was that kind of man. What he said was, "You've been thinking about this for a while." Lorraine said 30 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That explains why you know exactly what you want." She said, "Yes. It also explains," he said, "why you're not second-guessing it once you've decided." She thought about that. She said, "If you've been thinking about something for 30 years, you've already done the second-guessing." He nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing a thought for later. The work on the exterior foundation took 3 weeks. Lorraine stood at the gate each morning during those weeks and watched the old upper structure come down in sections loaded onto trucks removed. It was the right thing. She had concluded this before the demolition began, and the demolition confirmed it. What had been there was not salvageable and had not been for years. What would be there instead was being built on Vavel's foundation, the foundation that Silas had said was the best he had seen in 40 years. The frame went up in November when the air had acquired the first real cold of the season, and the mornings required a coat. Lorraine came every day. She watched the frame rise on the foundation, and she thought about Vale building the original structure in 1889, the year he had gone back to his finished buildings and added the cavities, the year he had decided that the structures he trusted most were safer than the institutions that were supposed to be trustworthy. She thought about what it meant to build something with the intention that it would outlast you. She thought she was doing a version of the same thing. Not the same scale, not the same kind, but the same essential act, building something on a foundation that was already proven, intending it to hold the lives that would be lived inside it for longer than she could know. Walter built the bench in December. This was not in any plan. It was not in the matrix or the scope of work or the project timeline. It was Walter on a Saturday morning when Silas's crew was not working, sitting in the corner of the yard where the afternoon light fell best in the late hours of the day, with the scrap lumber from the framework and a set of basic tools, in the deliberate focus of a man who has spent 50 years working with his hands and knows what he is doing even when the application is new. He was not a woodworker. He knew this and did not pretend otherwise. But he was a man who understood the basic principles of making something solid. Square corners, appropriate fasteners for the load, the relationship between stability and the way weight was distributed across a structure. He worked for most of the day. Lorraine came at 2 in the afternoon and found him finishing the final joint, running a hand along the seat surface to check for anything that would catch or snag. She did not say anything. She sat down on it. He watched her. She sat for a moment. "Most comfortable bench I've ever sat on," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression she got when she meant something exactly as she said it and wanted him to know that. He received it as the gift it was. He had built it for her, and she knew he had built it for her, and she was telling him she knew. This was how they had always communicated the things that did not require more language than was necessary. He sat beside her. They sat on the bench Walter had built in the December afternoon in the yard of the house that was being made on the foundation of the man who had sealed their deeds in a wall in 1927, in the town Lorraine had put in the folder in 2015, with 2 words written on the back of a photograph. They did not say anything for a while. Then Walter said, "You knew, didn't you, about this town, before we found the listing?" She said, "I had it in the folder since 2015. He looked at her. "You didn't tell me," he said. Not a recrimination, a recognition. She said, "The number wasn't there yet in 2015. If I had told you, we would have looked at the number, which wasn't there, and the conversation would have ended in the right place, which was not yet. I didn't want the conversation to end, so I put it in the folder and I kept it there. He was quiet for a moment. How long, he said. How long were you keeping things in the folder before you told me they were in there? She considered this. The first thing I put in, she said, was a photograph of a stone cottage in Vermont. November 1993. From a magazine in the dentist's waiting room. He looked at her. He started to say something. Then he didn't. Then he said, "That's 30 years, Lorraine." She said, "Yes." He said, "You kept a folder for 30 years." She said, "I kept a folder for 30 years." He looked at the house, at the frame on Vale's foundation, at the stone arch with its trained vines on the left side of the property, at the bench they were sitting on. He said, "Well, it worked." She said, "Yes, it did." The legal resolution came in March. Constance called at 9 on a Tuesday morning, which Lorraine had come to recognize as the time Constance reserved for significant communications, the same way she had recognized in the plant offices that certain managers held certain kinds of information for certain times of day. She was in the kitchen of the new house. They had moved in on a Thursday in January, cold and clear, the mountains visible to the west in the winter light that Lorraine had seen in the folder photographs and now saw from the kitchen window. The good furniture had come out of storage. The table from the apartment they had rented for 14 years was in the kitchen. The scratch on the left corner from when Caroline was 9 years old and pushed her bicycle through the kitchen was still there, sir. Lorraine had looked at the scratch the first morning they ate at the table and had felt something she recognized as continuity, the thread running from the apartment to the house the life accumulated and carried forward. She answered Constance's call with her coffee in her hand. Constance spoke for 10 minutes. The claim to 5 of the 7 Vale parcels had been upheld by the court. 2 had been ruled against, as Constance had predicted, on adverse possession grounds from neighboring properties with well-established claims. 5 remained. Constance named the assessed value of the 5 parcels in current market conditions. Lorraine set her coffee down. She stood very still for a moment. Then she sat. She sat at the kitchen table, the table with the scratch from 1993, and she looked out the window at the garden. The winter had not yet fully released its hold on the beds, but Lorraine had planted bulbs in October before the ground had frozen, and the first tips of green were showing in the border where she had placed them. The apple tree she had ordered from a nursery in Hartfield would arrive in April. She had a specific spot for it in the southeast corner of the property where the morning light was best. She thought about 1967, the studio apartment, $40 a month, the card table and the 2 folding chairs and the mattress on the floor, the pipes that knocked in the cold. She thought about the morning she had painted the kitchen wall yellow. She thought about the folder. The Vermont cottage in November 1993, the Tennessee farmhouse in 2008, the photograph taken through the car window in 2015, the Vale letter from 1928, the letter from the woman in Hartfield who had written "Thank you for fighting." She thought about all the first of the months, 53 years of them, the reliable arrival of the day when the money moved to someone else's account and the roof continued to belong to someone else, and the place they lived could at any moment be reclaimed by the person whose name was actually on the deed. She had prepared for the house for 30 years. She had not prepared for this. But she understood it in the specific way she understood the things that arrived from the direction of patience rather than the direction of planning. You worked toward the thing you could see. What waited on the other side of the thing you could see was not something you could prepare for. It was something you were either ready for or not, and readiness was different from preparation. Readiness was what accumulated over 30 years of keeping a folder and updating a matrix and writing letters to families you had never met, and a letter to an architect who had been dead since 1931. She picked up the phone and called Walter. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Sit down." He was already sitting, he said. He was in the reading room she had designated with the east-facing window, reading the paper the way he read everything from the beginning systematically. She told him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Lorraine." She said, "Yes." He said, "Lorraine." She said, "I know." The Hale case resolved on the same day, which Constance had managed with the efficiency of someone who understood that multiple proceedings moving toward resolution on parallel tracks could be synchronized if you manage the timing. She mentioned it at the end of the call, the way you mention a necessary piece of business after the significant news. Richard Hale had his license revoked. The civil case had settled in a manner that returned to Lorraine and Walter the full amount they had paid for the property with additional damages. The state real estate board's investigation had uncovered three other similar transactions, and the criminal charges that followed were described by Constance with the neutral satisfaction of an attorney who has done her job correctly and sees the result. Lorraine received this with the same directness. It was justice which mattered. It was not the thing that mattered most, which was the house and the foundation and the 5 parcels and the morning light in the kitchen. But it was part of the accounting. She thought about the woman in Hartfield who had written "Thank you for fighting." She made a note to write to her again. The Saturday in April, when the garden was coming into itself, Lorraine invited Everett Prushaw for dinner. She had been planning this since October, since the moment the urgency of the practical situation had subsided enough to make room for the ordinary and important act of acknowledging what someone had done for you. Everett had come to the door in the middle of a crisis with a flashlight and 30 years of accumulated knowledge, and the particular quality of a man who says what he means. He had sat at the card table and told them about Vale and the cavity without knowing what it would lead to. He had stood at a respectful distance while they opened the box because he understood that it was their discovery, not his. He had been there at the right time in the right way. She made the meal in the kitchen with the morning light window, which was not morning anymore, but evening, the light from the west coming through at a lower angle that turned the kitchen, the particular gold that kitchens become when the work in them is for something good. She made the things she made when a meal was supposed to be a meal rather than a performance. They ate at the good table. Walter opened the bottle of wine Everett had brought, which was a better bottle than the occasion technically required and therefore exactly right. They talked about the property and the legal resolution and the parcels and the plans. Constance was moving to establish formal title. 2 of the parcels they were keeping. 3 they intended to donate to the Grayfield Land Trust, which Everett had served on the board of for 11 years, a fact Lorraine had discovered in her research and had considered relevant to the decision. When they mentioned the donation, Everett set down his fork. He looked at Lorraine. "You don't have to do that," he said. "We're not doing it because we have to," she said. "We're doing it because Vale spent his life building things in this community, and he had no one to leave them to. He left them to whoever found them. We found them. And we want the community to have some of it." She paused. "He built the foundation the house is sitting on," she said. "The least we can do is put some of his land back into the place he built it for." Everett was quiet for a moment. "Edmund would have liked you," he said. Lorraine said, "I think I would have liked him." After dinner, Lorraine took Everett out to see the arch. The vines had come back with the spring responding to the pruning and training she had done in the fall with the particular enthusiasm of plants that have been shown where they are wanted and have decided to comply. The arch was visible now in a way it had not been through the years of unchecked growth. The stone clean and intact, the vines growing along the curve in the way that climbing plants grow along structures they have been invited to inhabit. Tom had built the arch from the same stone as the repaired path, following the design Lorraine had sketched in October, based on what she had found in the Historical Society files and what she could see in the old photographs. It looked as Silas had predicted, like it had always been there, because in the design sense it had. She had simply made it real again. Everett stood and looked at it for a moment. "She wanted to keep them," Walter said, "from behind them." "Of course she did," Everett said. Lorraine looked at the vines. She thought about what they had been and what they had done and what they were now. The vines had covered the notice that revealed the fraud. The vines had penetrated the walls and made them fail, which had opened the crack which had led to the box. The vines had been simultaneously the source of the disaster and the mechanism of the recovery. She had thought about this many times, and she had not entirely resolved it into something that fit cleanly into a lesson. But she had decided that this was probably appropriate. The most important things did not fit cleanly into lessons. They fit into stories which could hold contradiction in a way that lessons could not. She had a story, 53 years of the first of the month, a folder kept for 30 years, a condemned house with a sound foundation, and vines that held the walls upright until the walls were ready to fall, a box in a wall from 1927, a letter written to no one in 1928, a woman who had the patience to wait for the walls to speak. Lorraine stood under the arch in the April evening and she looked at the garden. At the bulbs she had planted in October, coming up in the border along the path. At the corner where the apple tree would go when it arrived from the nursery in Hartfield. At the bench Walter had built in December in the corner where the afternoon light fell best. She thought about the folder. She thought about the morning she would go to the reading room with the east-facing window and take out the folder and open it to the last page she had added the summary. 5 parcels. Legal path established. Foundation sound. Begin. She would add one more page. Not a photograph, not a printout, not a note about a house she wanted. Those pages were done. The record was complete. She would add the letter from Edmund Vale. Not a copy. The original, the one from the oilskin, the one Walter had read aloud in the condemned house in the dim lantern light, while the May morning continued outside. The one that ended with the sentence about patience and walls. She would put it at the very front of the folder where she had kept the Vermont cottage for 30 years. The beginning of the record. Because she had come to understand where the story had actually started. Not in 1993 when she cut the page from the dentist's waiting room magazine. Earlier than that. In 1928, when a man with no heirs and a house he trusted more than any institution wrote a letter to whoever would eventually come. In 1889, when he laid the foundation that Silas Brandt would look at 130 years later and say was the best he had seen in 40 years of work. The story had started before she was born. She had simply been the person who arrived when it needed someone to arrive. She turned back to the house. The kitchen light was on and visible from the garden, warm against the April evening. The west windows that Silas had installed at her request were catching the last of the day's light and holding it. The oak door frame original to the structure framed the entrance the way Vale had framed things for permanence rather than decoration. Everett was saying something to Walter about the land trust paperwork. Walter was listening with the attentive patience he brought to things he needed to understand. These were sounds that belonged to a house being used by people who lived in it. She looked at the folder under her arm. 30 years in a manila folder. Torn pages and printouts, and a photograph taken through a car window, and a letter written in 1928. She thought the house you were meant to have was always waiting for the moment you were ready to receive it. She thought some walls have to come down before you can see what they were hiding. She thought if we had bought a house 20 years ago, we would have bought the wrong house. She said nothing. She stood in her garden in the April light, in the town she had put in the folder in 2015, with 2 words on the back of a photograph, and she felt very specifically the weight of the folder in the way she had felt it shift on the evening she and Walter had confirmed the number, and he had said quietly, "We're going to do it." Not lighter. That was not what shift meant in this context. The folder was the same weight it had always been, heavier if anything with everything that had been added to it. What had shifted was what the weight meant. It had been the weight of carrying a hope forward through years when the hope was not yet possible. It was now the weight of having arrived somewhere, of holding a record that was complete rather than ongoing, of standing inside the story instead of working toward it. The folder was full. She walked back through the arch and into the garden of the house on Grayfield Road, under the vines that had learned where they were wanted and had decided to stay. And the April evening held everything in the particular way of evenings in that part of Virginia, when the spring has finally committed, and the mountains are visible in the last of the light, and the thing you built is standing, and everything in it is yours. The apple tree arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April, delivered by a man from the Hartfield nursery, in a white pickup with soil still on his work gloves, and the unhurried manner of someone who has been transporting living things for a long time, and understands that living things prefer to be moved without drama. Lorraine met him at the gate. The tree was small. She had known it would be small. You did not order a Honeycrisp apple tree in October and expect it to arrive in April as a mature specimen. It arrived as what it was, which was a beginning. A sapling with the specific lean of something that has been growing in a container and has not yet had the chance to understand which direction the prevailing wind comes from. The root ball was wrapped in burlap. The trunk was approximately the diameter of her wrist. The nurseryman set it at the edge of the property and looked at her. "Southeast corner," she said, "where the morning light is best." He carried it to the southeast corner without asking how she knew where the morning light was best. She had been watching the light in this garden since May of the previous year, first through the gate, and then through the construction, and then through the winter of living in the finished house. She knew where the light was. She watched him dig the hole. It was the right depth and the right width, and he did it with the efficiency of someone who has dug a great many holes for a great many trees and has arrived at the technique through repetition rather than theory. When the hole was ready, he removed the burlap and set the tree in and backfilled the soil and tamped it with his boot in the way that trees needed to be tamped firmly enough to remove the air pockets but not so firmly as to compact the drainage. He staked it. She wrote the check and he drove away, and she stood in the southeast corner of the garden and looked at the tree. It would take years. This was not a surprise and not a disappointment. She had been keeping the folder for 30 years. She understood something about time and about the relationship between planting and arriving. You planted now for what you would have in 10 years. You maintain now for what you would have in 20. You built on the right foundation now for what would still be standing in 100. Edmund Vale had understood this. She put her hand on the stake lightly, the way you put your hand on something you are beginning. Then she went inside to make coffee. The house was alive with morning in the way that houses are alive with morning when the construction is right. When the orientation was decided by someone who understood what morning meant in the specific latitude and season of the place. The kitchen window did what she had always known a kitchen window should do, which was to make the first cup of coffee something you took to the light and stood in for a moment before the day made its demands. She had made that window happen. 30 years in the folder and 6 months of watching Silas build, and that window was hers in the specific way that things are yours when you made them rather than receive them. She stood in the light with her coffee. She thought about the letter she needed to write. The second letter to the woman in Hartfield was something she had been composing in her mind since March, since the day Constance had called with the results of the title searches and the resolution of the Hale case. She had written the first letter in the second week of the 3 weeks at the rental apartment, when she was still waiting, and the writing was partly a way of not waiting. The woman had written back. Thank you for fighting. She had not written again since. She had been in the work of the house, the daily decisions, and the daily presence, and the winter of making the new place genuinely inhabited rather than just occupied. But the debt of the correspondence had been sitting in the back of her mind, and it was time to address it. She went to the reading room. The reading room was the one with the east window, the one she had designated before they moved in. It had the desk she had bought for the purpose, plain oak, the right height, with drawers that closed without forcing. The folder was in the top right drawer where it had lived since they moved in. She took it out. She sat with it for a moment without opening it. The folder was thicker than it had ever been. 30 years of clippings and printouts and photographs had been augmented by the documents of the preceding year. The Vale letter, the summary she had written on the morning of the title search results, the letter from the woman in Hartfield, the letter she had written to Edmund Vale and tucked in the back. She had not yet reorganized the folder the way she had been thinking about reorganizing it. The Vermont cottage was still at the front where it had been since 1993, the first entry, and therefore the first thing you saw when you opened it. The Vale letter was at the back where she had put it the night they found the box. She had been thinking since the resolution of everything in March that the folder needed to be reorganized. Not because the original order was wrong, but because the story it told now was different from the story it had told when she was keeping it. She had been keeping a record of the search. The search was over. The record was complete. What the folder needed now was to tell the complete story in the right order. She opened it. She did something she had not done since they arrived in Grayfield. She took every page out. She laid them on the desk in the order they had been in. The Vermont cottage photograph, 1993. The Tennessee farmhouse printout, 2008. The Grayfield photograph from the car window, 2015, with "This Town" someday on the back. The Ivy Cottage listing photographs from when they found it. The Vale letter, the summary from the legal pad, the letter from the woman in Hartfield, the letter she had written to Vale himself. She looked at everything laid out. Then she picked up the Vale letter. She put it at the front, because it was where the story had actually started, not in 1993, when she was looking for a house, but in 1928 when a man was putting things in walls for people he would never meet. The story had started with him. She had walked into it from the other end, from the direction of patience and waiting, but the story itself had begun when he sealed the box. Vermont cottage, 1993. This went second where it had always been because it was where her part of the story had started. Tennessee farmhouse, 2008. The note on the back, timing wrong, financial crisis keep. This was the record of a year when keeping was an act of will rather than comfort, and it belonged in the folder for that reason. Grayfield from the car window, 2015. This town, someday. The listing photographs of the Ivy Cottage. The condensed record of what they had believed they were buying, 11 images that showed only the outside of a thing, the beautiful surface of something structurally compromised, the particular way that Denton Hale had presented what he wanted them to see and hidden what he did not. The summary from the legal pad. 5 parcels. Legal path established. Foundation sound. Begin. The letter from the woman in Hartfield. Thank you for fighting. The letter she had written to Vale. We're here. We found it. We're going to take care of it. She put them back in the folder in this order. Then she sat for a moment and thought about what else belonged. She opened the desk drawer and took out the lined paper, and she wrote a second letter to the woman in Hartfield. She wrote about the apple tree being planted that morning in the southeast corner. She wrote about the 5 parcels in the legal resolution and the fact that Hale would not be practicing again. She wrote about the house and the foundation and the morning light in the kitchen. She wrote, I wanted you to know that the thing we found on the wall turned out to be sufficient, not just for the house, but for what came after it. I thought you deserved to know that the fighting had a result. She addressed the envelope and set it aside to mail. Then she wrote a second letter, not to the woman in Hartfield. To the other family, Constance had identified the couple in Millbrook who had not written back, whose letter had gone unanswered. She had been thinking about this. She did not know if the letter had not been received or had not been answered. Either was possible. She wrote it again briefly without reproach, simply offering what she had offered the first time, the information that someone had fought back and the willingness to be in contact if that was useful. She folded both letters and put them in the envelopes. Then she took out one more piece of the lined paper and she wrote a third letter, which was not a letter she had planned to write, which arrived the way certain necessary things arrive, without announcement. She wrote to Carolyn, not about the legal resolution which Caroline knew, not about the house which Caroline had visited in February and had walked through room by room with the specific attention of a daughter who is seeing the thing her mother waited 30 years for and is trying to see it correctly. Not about any of the practical facts. She wrote about the folder. She told Caroline that there was a folder in the top right drawer of the desk in the reading room and that the folder had been kept for 30 years and that it was now organized in the order of a complete story rather than an ongoing search. She wrote, I kept it because I needed to keep the record. I'm telling you about it now because someday you may want to know the record exists and the record is complete and it is in the drawer and it is yours when you need it. She did not explain what for. She trusted Caroline to understand. She sealed all 3 envelopes. She went to get the mail. Everett was at his gate when she came out. He had the manner of a man who had been at his gate for some time and was not pretending he hadn't been. He was wearing his garden coat and carrying a trowel, which was a sufficiently plausible reason to be at the gate that it constituted a kind of propriety. She had come to like Everett Prushaw in the way you come to like people who are precisely what they appear to be. He was not a man who performed himself. He was quiet when he had nothing worth saying and spoke when he did, and what he said was worth hearing, and this was a combination that aged well. She said, good morning. He said, the apple tree arrived. She said, yes. He said, southeast corner. She said, Edmund's notes in the historical file mentioned that the original garden plan included fruit trees in the southeast corner. I thought it was appropriate. He looked at the corner where the tree was visible above the fence line, its stake marking its position, its small crown not yet visible from outside. He said, he would have thought so too. She said, I know. She mailed the letters at the post office on Millbrook Road, the one that was 2 rooms and a counter, and had been in the same building since 1912, according to the sign above the door. The woman at the counter knew her by now. She had been coming here since October, and small post offices in small towns had long memories. The woman said, good morning, Mrs. Briggs. Lorraine said, good morning. 3 certified, please. The woman said, the Hartfield one again. Lorraine said, yes, and Millbrook this time. In Cincinnati. She watched the letters go behind the counter. She thought about correspondence as a form of record keeping. The folder was a record of the search. The letters were a record of the discovery distributed outward to the people whose stories intersected with it. The woman in Hartfield had said, thank you for fighting. Lorraine had responded, the fighting had a result. Carolyn would someday open the drawer and find the folder and know the record was there. The records she kept had always been for other people as well as for herself. This had been true at the plant where the records she maintained were used by everyone in the operation and outlasted her tenure there by years, still in the filing system she had built, still in the order she had established. It had been true of the folder which she had kept for herself, but which was also, she now understood, for Walter, who had not known the full extent of what she had been carrying, but whose life had been shaped by the fact that she was carrying it. It was true of the letters. You kept the record because someone would need it. She drove back to Grayfield Road. Walter was in the garden when she arrived. He had the particular posture of a man examining something with professional attention, which meant he was looking at the bench. He looked at the bench most days, not with dissatisfaction, with the continuing assessment of a craftsman who understands that a thing well made is worth the ongoing attention of the person who made it, who deserves to know whether it is holding the way it was built to hold. It was holding. She stood beside him. He said, "The joints are sound." She said, "I told you they were." He said, "You said it was comfortable." "That's different from sound." She said, "For this bench, they're the same thing." He looked at her. He had been doing this more often since March, she had noticed, looking at her in the way that contained more than looking. She understood what it contained. He had been thinking about the folder since the dinner with Everett, since she had told him how long she had kept it and what was in it. She could feel him thinking about it the way she had always been able to feel him thinking the slight additional presence in the room of something being processed. She had given him time. He said, "The folder." She said, "Yes." He said, "I keep thinking about it." She said, "I know." He said, 30 years. She said, "Yes." He said, "You never told me about Grayfield, about having it in the folder since 2015. She said, "No." He said, "Was that for me keeping it?" Not saying. She thought about this. She had thought about it many times since April from different angles. She said, "It was for both of us. If I had told you in 2015, the conversation would have ended in the right place for 2015, which was not yet. I didn't want the right answer in 2015 to close the door on the right answer later." He was quiet. He said, "And now?" And she said, "Now the door is open. Now we're inside it." He looked at the house, at the frame on Vale's foundation, in the stone path, in the arch, in the apple tree, in the southeast corner. He said, "I should have known you had a plan." She said, "You knew I had a folder." He said, "I knew you had a folder. I didn't know the folder was a plan." She said, "They were always the same thing." He laughed. It was a quiet laugh, the kind that came from recognition rather than humor. The kind that meant you have seen something true, and the truth of it is a relief rather than a surprise. She sat on the bench. He sat beside her. The apple tree was visible from where they sat, the stake marking its position, the small crown of it not yet expressive of what it would become. In 10 years, it would be a tree. In 20, it would be an established tree, the kind you planted for the people who came after you rather than for yourself. She would see it become a tree. Whether she would see it become established was a different question. One she held without anxiety, because anxiety was not useful, and because she had already done the thing that mattered, which was to plant it. She said, "The Constance situation is finishing up." He said, "I know." She called yesterday. She said the title transfers are complete for 4 of the 5. The 5th is still in process, but the claim is upheld. It's just paperwork. He said she said that. She said the land trust paperwork for the 3 parcels is also in process. Everett is handling the trust side. He's been on the board for 11 years, and he knows the process. He said, "I know." She said, "So it's done." He looked at her, at the specific way she said that, which was not triumphant, and not performative, and not even precisely emotional. It was the tone of completion, the tone of a woman who has been keeping a very long record and is making the final entry. He said, "How does it feel?" She thought about this. She said, "It feels like the weight has shifted. Not lighter, different." He said, "Different how?" She said, "When I was carrying the folder, the weight meant something was possible, but not yet real. Now the weight means something is real and also mine to maintain. Those are different responsibilities." He was quiet. She said, "The maintenance is better. I'm not keeping hope. I'm keeping a house." He put his arm around her. She leaned against him slightly, not in the way of people who need support, but in the way of people who have been beside each other long enough that the proximity is simply the form their contentment takes. The garden was coming fully into itself. The bulbs she had planted in October had done what bulbs do, and the border along the stone path was in color, the yellow and purple, and white of the early varieties giving way to the later ones that were still opening. The beds were not yet everything she had planned for them. There were years of planting ahead, but they were started, which was the necessary first thing. She thought about the letter to Vale in the folder. We're here. We found it. We're going to take care of it. She had written 3 things. They were here. That was the first year. They had found it. That was the box, the deeds, the legal resolution, the 5 parcels, the foundation that Silas said was the best he had ever seen. They were going to take care of it. That was this, all of this, the apple tree and the maintained vines and the bulbs and the border and the bench that was sound and the letters sent to the families who deserved to know. She was doing what she had written in the letter. She thought about something Val had written not in the letter she had been reading repeatedly for the past year, but in one of the letters in the Historical Society file that Everett had shown her in November. A letter Vale had written to a colleague about a building project in 1903. She had written the line down. It was in her notebook from the Historical Society visit in the compressed shorthand she used for things she wanted to keep. He had written, the buildings that last are not the ones built to impress. They are the ones built because the builder understood that what they were doing would matter to people they would never meet. She had thought about this many times since reading it. She had built the house from a folder. The folder was 30 years of knowing what she wanted and keeping the record of that knowing until the moment when wanting could become building. She had not built it to impress. She had built it because she understood without being able to say so in quite these terms at the time that this was the house that would matter to the people who lived in it after her. Walter, Caroline eventually, if life moved in the ways that life sometimes moved. The grandchildren who would grow up visiting the guest room with the bunk beds and the window seat and the storage for the toys that accumulated. She had planted the apple tree for them. She had kept the vines for Vale. She had built on the foundation for the house. The spring afternoon was moving toward evening. The light was at the angle it got in late April when the days were lengthening toward the long light of summer, but had not yet arrived there, the angle that put gold on things without the full weight of the summer sun behind it. The mountains to the west were in it, and the garden was in it, and the house was in it, and the bench Walter had built in December caught it along its top rail in the way that well-planed wood catches light when the surface is clean. She would need to mail the letters. She had mailed them already this morning, she remembered. She was ahead of herself. She was making notes about things that were done. This was not like her. She sat with this for a moment. She understood what it was. It was the particular displacement of a person who has finished something very long and is still inhabiting the habits of doing it. She had been keeping the record for 30 years. The record was complete. Her hands did not yet know what to do when they reached for the folder and found it finished. She would figure out what came next. She always had. She thought about Caroline's visit in February. Caroline had driven from Cincinnati on a Friday afternoon and stayed through Sunday. She had walked through every room with the specific quality of attention Lorraine recognized from the years when Caroline was still learning to see things the way her mother saw them. The focused cataloging look that moved from detail to detail without resting. She had stood in the kitchen at the morning window and said nothing for a moment. Then she had said, "You got the window right." Lorraine had said yes. Caroline had said, "It's exactly the way you always described it. I didn't know I knew what that meant until I saw it." Lorraine had not told Caroline about the folder then. She had waited. She was telling her now through the letter, which was the right way to tell her. The folder was something Caroline needed to find in the drawer when the time was right, not something that needed to be explained in advance. Explanations imposed meaning. The folder found when it was ready to be found would explain itself. She had learned this from Vale. He had not explained the box. He had built the cavity, placed the box, sealed it, and written the letter. He had trusted whoever came to understand it when they arrived. He had been right to trust that. She had understood it. Not immediately, not in the first moment, but in the accumulation of days since the discovery, in the way that the understanding of a complicated thing builds through the repeated encounter with its evidence. Caroline would understand the folder. The evening light was at its last angle now, the gold gone out of it and the blue of the late hour coming in. Walter had gone inside 30 minutes ago to start dinner, which was what he did at this hour when she was still in the garden, which was something they had settled into over the months of living in the house, without discussing it the way long-established patterns settle into available forms. She stayed for another moment. She was thinking about something that she had not yet thought through fully, which was what the folder was now that it was complete. It had been an ongoing project for 30 years. Projects, when completed, required a decision about what happened next. You could close the file. You could archive it. You could give it to someone who would continue it in their own direction. She had already decided to give it to Carolyn. She had written that in the letter. But she was thinking about what she would do next. Not what she would keep now that the folder was complete, but what she would build. Because she understood about herself, someone who built things not in the way of Walter, who built with his hands, but in the way of someone who understands that the thing you are working toward shapes the work of every day you spend working toward it, and that the work of every day is how you live. The folder had been what she was working toward. The house was the arrival. Arrivals were not endings. She had the 5 parcels. 3 were going to the land trust. 2 she was keeping. She had been thinking about the 2 she was keeping. She had been thinking about them since Constance had named them in March, described their locations, described their characteristics. One was a parcel of open land adjacent to a watershed protection area, about 12 acres undeveloped. One was a smaller parcel in the north part of the county, 4 acres with a stone wall on the eastern boundary that the title record showed had been built by Vail himself in 1887 as part of a larger property development that had subsequently been divided. She had been to see both of them. She had stood on each one and walked its boundary and looked at what it was. The 12-acre parcel was open land with a creek running through the southeast corner, which was the right corner for water if you were thinking about what would grow there. It had been sitting in legal ambiguity for 90 years. It had been nobody's responsibility. It had the particular quality of land that has been left to its own devices for a very long time and has developed in that time its own ideas. The 4-acre parcel with Vail's stone wall had a different quality. The wall was intact. The stones Vail had laid in 1887 were still in the positions he had set them, still marking the eastern boundary of what had once been a larger property, still performing the function of stone walls, which is not merely containment, but declaration. This is where this thing begins. This is where this thing ends. She had stood at the wall on a cold afternoon in March and run her hand along the stones the way she had run her hand along the wall of the box. The same quality of construction, the same conviction that what you built with the right materials in the right way was worth building for the people who came after you. She was going to build something on those 2 parcels. She did not yet know exactly what. She had some thoughts, the kind of thoughts that were not yet conclusions and therefore did not get spoken. But the direction was there. The folder was complete for the Grayfield house, the house they had come to find and had found in the only way it was possible to find it, which was through the wall coming down. The next folder was not yet a folder. It was a thought held quietly, keeping its shape in the space she had made for it by completing the last thing. This was how she had always worked. You made space. The next thing arrived. She stood up from the bench. She looked at the house, at the lit windows, at the kitchen where Walter was making dinner on the stove she had specified, at the reading room window with its east-facing glass, dark now in the evening. She looked at the arch where the vines were growing along the curve in their trained direction, the ones she had kept, the ones Vail had designed, the garden around the ones that had been the disaster and the key to ending it. She looked at the apple tree in the southeast corner, staked against the prevailing wind, its small crown not yet visible in the late dark. She thought about what she wanted to say to Vail if she were writing in the folder tonight. She had written, "We're here. We found it. We're going to take care of it." What she would write tonight if she were writing was, "We are," not as a beginning, as a confirmation, as a record. They were here. They had found it. They were taking care of it. The apple tree was planted. The stone wall on the northern parcel was still standing. The foundation Vail had laid was under the house that was now their house, the house built on the record of 30 years of keeping the record. They were here. She walked through the arch. The vines were damp from the evening, the new growth soft in the way of spring growth, before it has hardened the leaves still at the stage of unfolding. She moved through them without disturbing them. They grew where they grew, and she moved through them, and neither disturbed the other. This was the relationship between a garden and the person who maintained it, when both had been allowed to become what they were. She went inside. The kitchen smelled of the dinner Walter was making, something with the rosemary she had planted in October in the herb bed along the south wall of the house, the rosemary that had survived its first winter and was coming back stronger than it had gone in the way established plants come back. The light was warm. The morning light window was dark now, but she could feel its presence the way she could feel the presence of things that were right, that were in the right place. She hung her coat on the hook by the door, the hook that was at the right height and in the right position because she had specified both in October. Walter turned from the stove. He said, "Good." She said, "Good." She set the table. The good table, the one with the scratch on the left corner. The scratch from 1993, the year Caroline was 9 years old and pushed her bicycle through the kitchen of the rented house in Hartwell. The year Lorraine had cut the Vermont cottage from the dentist's waiting room magazine and put it in the folder. The same year, the same table, the scratch from the bicycle, and the start of the record. She set the plates and the glasses and the forks, and she stood for a moment looking at the table with the table set. This was what the folder had been for. Not the legal resolution, not the 5 parcels, not the justice served to Denton Hale and the families he had defrauded. Those things were real, and they mattered, and they were part of the story. But this was what the folder had been for. The table set in the kitchen with the morning light window, the dinner made from the rosemary planted in October, the chair she would sit in and the chair Walter would sit in, and the view from the table to the window that was dark now, but in the morning would be exactly what she had always known it should be. This right here, 53 years of the first of the month. Every apartment, every rented house, every address that had belonged to someone else and could be reclaimed. The folder kept in the drawer full of other people's houses, kept because she believed the house was coming if she did not stop believing. This was the house. She sat down. Walter brought the plates and sat across from her, and they ate at the kitchen table in the house on Grayfield Road, in the town she had put in the folder in 2015, in the house built on the foundation of a man who had died in 1931, without children, and had left his most important things inside the walls of what he trusted, waiting for whoever had the patience to wait for the walls to speak. The folder was in the drawer in the reading room. The apple tree was in the southeast corner. The letters were in the mail. The vines were at the arch. The bench was in the corner where the afternoon light fell best. The record was complete. They were here.